Portland. And then we moved away to California because I got a job there. And then we came back because I retired and our boys live there. So back to the boys and back to Portland, which I love. I love Portland, but the weather sucks in the winter.
Yeah. And
Remember,
sometimes in the
you're
summer.
being recorded. Remember?
Oh, no, that's right. Oh, that's terrible. Okay.
So,
I love
so good
Portland.
morning, good morning, everyone. I don't know if you had a chance just before this,
You froze.
our president and Justice Breyer.
No, I didn't hear it.
I want you to know that Justice Breyer went to Lowell High School in San Francisco, my alma mater, along with his brother, who's a couple years younger. My sister put on Facebook an interview that was done by a Lowell High School teacher when he was nominated to the Supreme Court. It is also, you should know, International Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27th, which is today, which was evidently the day that Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army in 1945. That was declared by the United Nations. It's not something that, somehow it doesn't really appear on the Jewish calendar because we have our own Yom HaShoah, which comes usually in April, right after Passover. But I guess the news was that the great state of Tennessee has outlawed the inclusion of mouse in the 8th grade curriculum because it contains swear words. So funny that those things should come at the same time. So, I see Lori Fendel. Let me admit her. There we go. So I hope it's a good day for everyone. What I'd like to do is actually go back for a minute, because I think there were things that we missed last week, and one of the things that struck me was, the reasons for the mitzvot, which is usually called Ta'amei mitzvot, which there's a great deal of discussion about whether we should explore the reasons for the mitzvot altogether. I think one of the reasons is that once you come up with a reason for observing the mitzvah, which is not stated, if the reason changes or is no longer valid, then if you are observing it for that reason, all of a sudden your reason disappears. And so there's a strong attitude among some that the reasons for the mitzvot should not be explored. And the reason I mention that is because you remember that in Jewish tradition, we divide Jewish laws into mishpatim and chukim. Generally, mishpatim are those that are obvious why we observe them, and chukim are not only not obvious, but in many cases, they are to be observed by Jewish tradition simply because God told us so. According to Maimonides, the difference is a little different. He says that the mishpatim are where the reasons are transparent, and chukim are laws where the reasons are hidden. And then last week, our author talked about Maimonides exploring the religion of the Sabians. Well, I tried to look up Sabians and didn't get very, very far. Evidently, Sabians are mentioned 3 times in the Quran, and nobody knows who they are, who these people are that there's different opinions. But Maimonides said in what we read last week that several of the mitzvot are responses to the Sabians, and he listed six. So the first was, if you remember, that these are some of our rules are anti-pagan laws, because many of the Sabians left over still in Hinduism is that they venerated cows, and therefore we sacrifice animals, cows, to protect against paganism. This is erasing pagan conditioning. You remember then there was a second one, which he says the rule about not eating the produce from trees for 3 years was to remove the temptation to use magic in order to celebrate the tree's development, which was a Sabian tradition. And the third was that the Sabians used to wear ceremonial robes made out of wool and linen, and to distinguish ourselves from their pagan practices, the law forbade the wearing of wool and linen, shatnez. And he goes on with several others. But I got to tell you, if those are really the reasons, after Maimonides did a huge exploration of the Sabians, you have to ask, why are we still doing this? So I think this proves the point. As a matter of fact, these three were, I don't know if they're fully exemplary of the whole list of Ta'amei mitzvot, but if they are, he's come up with, it seems to be very poor reasons. Anybody have any response about that? About the reasons for the mitzvot? That was in last week's reading. Yeah, Barbara?
Well, this has always bothered me forever, the idea of the mitzvot and why keep doing them. If religion can evolve and religion can change, and we have, because we aren't making sacrifices anymore, and he talked about that the evolution of a religion, then why don't we have the right to analyze the mitzvot and decide as time goes by that maybe they were written 5,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, or whenever they were discussed and argued and augmented, and maybe it is not appropriate anymore. Without the entire religion falling apart, what would be so bad if we didn't have to observe the mitzvot? I mean, keeping them as a holy thing. Why? What would happen?
And you remember at one point he talked about the evolution of halacha in terms of, an example that's given is sacrifice. That our ancestors sacrificed animals because that was the ancient way of worship, and therefore it was important. Wait a minute, I got two people in the waiting room. Where are they? Oh, Jennifer and Alan. I apologize. I didn't see that you were waiting there. So he does accept that idea that in fact the law can evolve, can change. The question is when and how. I mean, obviously he decided that he didn't like the idea of sacrifice, nor the concept of going back to sacrifice when the temple is being rebuilt, I presume. But in other areas, I don't know if there's any other area where he felt that. Now, we do have a kind of evolution. My favorite example is, of course, Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat was which we just observed last week, Tu B'Shvat was a tax holiday. It was April 15th, or not actually payday on taxes, but It was Tu B'Shvat that you, in the middle of the winter, when you calculated how much produce you made over the last year, and you calculated your tithes on Tu B'Shvat. Well, we know how Tu B'Shvat evolved. It evolved into a holiday in which we identify with the land. When we weren't there, so that we ate produce. It evolved into the holiday somehow of the Jewish National Fund, of building the land and purchasing trees, and evolved more today into a holiday of ecology. So here you have a holiday that should have disappeared, and we have other holidays that actually have disappeared. We have a holiday called Tu B'Av, it's disappeared. We had a holiday called Nicanor's Day, it disappeared. So certain things have evolved and disappeared. Others have evolved, and some of them change without our even noticing them, I think. Change in dress, change in certain ways in which we, I think there is ongoing evolution. The question is, should it be conscious or not? Or should it somehow happen by happenstance, the evolution? Anybody think of other examples of halakha evolving, changing, where somehow we lost a reason for observing something, and we stopped observing them? I don't know. There's a fast day on the day after Rosh Hashanah. Maybe there are people who fast on the day after the second day of Rosh Hashanah, but I don't know any.
There's that holiday about the Shoeva, the
Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which is connected to Sukkot. Yes, with pouring water out. It's sort of magic, during Sukkot, we celebrate the harvest, but we are already nervous about the next harvest. So the kind of magic where we pour water onto the ground as symbolic rain. So there are some traditions that we don't do and we don't do anymore. Some of it evolves naturally, and some of it doesn't. Lisa?
Well, one thing I thought of, which isn't a holiday, and I'm just remembering from Melton years ago, but it seems to me that how you keep kosher and what's classified as kosher has evolved over time. And what sticks in my mind is that chickens weren't initially considered meat, and sometime in, I don't know, the Middle Ages or somebody decided they were meat. So all sorts of things change. Over time.
Certainly discussion about that. That's actually in the Talmud about fish and fowl, how to categorize them. But we continue to have discussions like, is swordfish kosher or not? You know about this conversation about swordfish? First of all, I love swordfish, but second, there are many people who don't eat swordfish because adult swordfish do not have scales, but baby swordfish do have scales. Kosher fish has to have fins and scales. It doesn't say when it has to have fins and scales. So many people say, since the adult swordfish does not have scales, it's not a kosher fish. Well, that's continuing, ongoing halachic discussion. So that really happens. Let's go on because but I think it's an interesting topic, and I think the reasons, and we're going to get into it in this chapter, whether the reasons are important or not. So chapter 8 begins with a declaration that mitzvot exist to perfect human beings on spiritual, physical, and a societal level. In other words, according to this explanation from Maimonides, it is a, what was that word? Anthropocentric centric way of looking at the mitzvot, but other places in the text, Rambam indicates that man is not the focus of the goal. It's not to perfect human beings. And the man that's mentioned is Yeshayahu Leibovitz. People familiar with that name? Yeshayahu, people are more familiar with his sister's name, who was a professor of Bible at the Hebrew University. Yeshayahu Leibovitz, I think, had 5 or 6 different doctorates. He taught sciences at the Hebrew University, but he was very prolific, on a very orthodox man. But he strongly believed that that even Maimonides, his reading of Maimonides was not human being centered, but God centered. We read there that the parable of how do you get someone to observe or to learn or do anything, a child, you might begin with incentives, like with, what did he say, nuts and figs, and as a child grows, you have to have supplementary motivation. You have to come up with, because the early motivation loses its effect, you need new incentives, all the way up to an incentive of doing the mitzvot for honor, for praise, which is not serving God for its own sake. But the feeling is the training, not doing the observance for its own sake, will eventually evolve into doing it for its own sake. Not for self-realization, but eventually you will get to the level of Abraham, who served God only out of love. You remember Abraham, the level that he gave us last week was Abraham was a lover of God without any religious, without any mitzvot, without any practice. And how do we use Abraham in that way? Because Abraham was willing to give up everything for God. He was the willingness to sacrifice his son was the last of selfish reasons for divine service. So Leibowitz says the idolatrous creed places man at the center, but the monotheistic creed places God at the center, which is the real Maimonides. He really had trouble with, and we then go on with the purpose of existence. Where for Maimonides, where our author now compares Maimonides with Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Pekuda, who was even an earlier Jewish philosopher. Rabban Bachya ibn Pekuda looked at the natural world and he said the natural world exists to enhance human beings. Rambam said, no, the natural world, the planets, the stars, the sun, the moon is not for our sake. The benefit to us is not the purpose. We are small and insignificant. Even so, we may see ourselves. So, are we really at the center? Our author says very succinctly, for Bachya, the world, one can look at the world and say, and everyone can say, for my sake, the world was created. whereas Rambam's view is, I am but dust and ashes. And you know where else those two statements come from? For my sake, the world was created, and I am but dust and ashes. There was a Hasidic tradition that everyone should have a note in a right pocket and a note in the left pocket, and that when he felt particularly down, should pull out the note that says, "For my sake, the world was created." In other words, and when he felt was having feelings of arrogance, he should pull out the note that says, "I am but dust and ashes," to pull him down. Rationality of the so is the again, is the purpose of the mitzvot the perfection of man, or is the purpose not for man's sake at all? Let me go on to why is this important? Why is this an important debate? Why am I keeping kosher? Is somehow my keeping kosher to make me to uplift me as a human being, or am I keeping kosher because of my love of God? They're very different ideas, and both of them seem to be present in Maimonides' arguing. So he talks about the distinction of motivation of action and the goal, which I thought was sort of interesting. Why do we obey the law? We obey the law because what is our motivation for obeying the law? Our motivation is fear of punishment. What is the goal of obeying the law? Is social order. What is the motivation for a college student studying? The motivation of a college student studying may be to get a diploma. But what is the goal of study? Is really to have a well-educated society. So the difference between what is the motivation and the goal. So the fulfillment of the mitzvot is to transform us, and that's the motivation. But the goal is love of God. That we have a sense of awe of being in the presence of the King. We feel the presence of the hidden. We live our lives not as a response we live our lives as a response to the presence of God. And with a sense of the presence of God is a sense of humility, awe, and a sense of God's presence inspires religious acts. When I think about that, I went to a public elementary school in San Francisco, and at the end of the term, the principal would walk in, and she would hand out report cards. She would call each individual kid up to the front of the room. She would open the report card, she would have a comment, and she would hand you the report card. It was either a compliment, But what was, as I reflect on that, I think about the fact that there was a sense of awe when Mrs. McCarthy walked into the room. You might be fooling around and, talking to the person next to you. She walked in the room and I don't know if it was her title or it was her manner or her style. Everybody came to attention. Now, she only did this, when she handed out report cards. No, she walked in other times too, but relatively rarely. And the question I have is, can that sense of awe, can that sense of humility be that our sense of God's presence inspires us to do religious acts through repetition. Repetition leads to training. Training leads to human perfection. Fulfilling the mitzvot creates a sense of God's presence. The last sentence, I want to see if we can all reflect for a minute on the very last sentence in chapter 8. In the last sentence, if you have it there, you can look at it. The last sentence is, the spiritual achievement consists of removing one's conception of God from world factors and in liberating oneself from enslavement to the ego. Again, the spiritual achievement, the goal, consists of removing one's conception of God from world factors and in liberating oneself from enslavement to the ego. Any thoughts on that last sentence? You don't have to be profound.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
So I have just a couple comments on this. And, as I read this, I thought about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, in my lay understanding of it, you work to change your thinking and change your behavior. And as you do more and more of it, the underlying emotions should follow suit. And I think that some different self-help groups talk about act as if you can behave a certain way and the behavior will follow. And in a way, as I read his thoughts about the mitzvot, I thought he's basically, it's a little bit like cognitive behavioral therapy. He's saying, do them regardless of how you feel, and the more you practice them, the more innate they will become. And you may or may not reach this high spiritual plane, but to get there, you need to get started. And so that's what that reminded me of. And then, when he talks about, and I think this chapter talked about, do the spheres reflect something revolving around the earth and man? I mean, he didn't realize they don't revolve around the earth, or do they put man in his place, right? And I think his position is, by reflecting on the spheres, you realize how really small you are in proportion to everything God created. And so, that was how I put this all together. Whether you ever reach spiritual enlightenment or whatever you want to call it here, you don't know, but you have to put yourself in the position to receive it. And I think that that's what he's talking about in this last paragraph, not using idolatry to help you understand God, or using things to help you understand God, accepting that you can't understand the whole, and if you put God first, it seems like he's saying, then your focus on self will dissipate, or it will help you get rid of your focus on self, which we innately do. So those were my thoughts.
I think that there's something about routine, and it's not just routine, it is something that I think that non-Orthodox Jews, and probably many Orthodox Jews, have lost the idea, the concept of being mitzuveh, of being commanded, right? So, okay, I'll observe Shabbat, but if something else comes up is important, okay, I want to observe Shabbat this week. So what? No. I'm mitzuveh. I am commanded, and that's part of a routine, and the routine will have, as I think you said, will have its effect on our lives. That this isn't casual. It's how I focus my life. Now, we all have routines, you know, but how we come to these routines, I think in large part we come to our routines, whether it's when we do laundry or you know, how we set the table. I think sometimes it's by hook, how we were raised, and sometimes I think it's by hook or by crook. But I think this is thought. You know, I'm doing this for a reason. I'm not doing this because it's convenient. I'm not doing this because it's the easy way to do it. I'm doing it because have this sense of awe of being commanded. And I think we may have, I think in large part, many of us have lost that. You know, yeah, it's nice to light candles on Friday night, but okay, so I don't light candles. So I only light three Shabbos a month. Is there anything terrible with that? Yeah, it's losing a sense of being, of this sense of being commanded. Lori? Lori, did you have your hand raised? I thought you raised your hand. Oh, okay. Barbara, did you want to add?
Yeah, I had so I understand it. I understand what it's saying and agree with what it's saying in its context of getting to the goal. I think my question comes in of, I'm questioning the goal. Like, to me, the two words that I'm having trouble with is service to God. Like that doesn't, how do I make that resonate? Service to God, is that as a goal? Like, is that how I want my life to go? And I can't identify with that. And love of God. We've talked about this supremely abstract concept of God. And then we say, love God. And your whole goal of doing all this is to get rid of the ego, which is a positive thing, to get rid of the ego. But the bottom line, the end goal, the elevated goal is love and serve God. So that's where I'm having trouble. So when you say mitzuveh or mitzuvah, I'm like mitzuvah al yedei ma. Like what is this abstract concept that I'm feeling commanded by to do what? To achieve love and service to an abstract idea? It's very difficult for me to associate the word love with an abstract concept.
I know these are difficult thoughts, but I think the question is, if you don't struggle with this, then why do any of it? Whether it is, you know, why not have that cheeseburger? Why make choices? Now, I may make different choices than the next person in terms of my observance, but I think that the observance that we do, why are we doing it? Is it cultural, simply to identify with other Jews? Is it nice customs, cute customs that we do? Or is there something larger? And I think that's the question that's being
Gone again.
chapter 9,
Wait,
which I liked a lot.
Speak up.
Rabbi?
Hello.
Yeah. Yes.
I think another thing that it does is it's the sense of community. That when you do some of these commandments or go to shul for that matter, you know that other people all over the world are doing exactly the same thing because they're Jewish. And that's part of, for me, why I do some of these. I mean, it makes me feel I'm part of something bigger than me.
Okay. It's you mentioned going to shul. Well, you're going to shul with other people, but there are an awful lot of these commandments that, in a sense, you do in the privacy of your home, all by yourself often.
But when you light Friday night candles, you know also that everywhere in the world on Shabbat, people are lighting those candles. It's more than me. It's more than a tradition just for me. It's bigger.
Well, let me take it a step further, and that is, okay, we're all lighting candles. Does it really matter whether you light the candles 18 minutes before, at least 18 minutes before sunset?
No.
Or, yeah, well, it depends who you talk to.
Yeah.
David?
I disagree with the concept that for Maimonides, God is an abstract being. The ontology in the Mishnah Torah is that God is a given. And on top of that, you have the concept of revelation. For Maimonides, that's indisputable. His task is to reconcile science and nature with revelation. That's the object, I think, of the overriding object, I think, of the guide.
Okay. And is he successful here or not?
I don't think he comes to a very clear answer by the end of the book.
Okay.
I think that's the
He's struggling.
the hidden lesson in the book. It's argued that it's there's a hidden meaning. Strauss argues that you can't take the book at face value. You have to look at the I forgot the term, the hidden meaning of the book. I think he ends up. I don't think he's very clear. And
I also
think it's possible to be clear.
I also wonder, somehow there's, in certain places, our author talks about the Mishnah Torah, in other places he talks about the guide for the perplexed. And he wants there to be consistency. And I wonder if between writing the Mishnah Torah and writing the Moreh Nevuchim, that Maimonides had his own evolution, his own thought. He was older, circumstances, the world had changed, his thought pattern. He didn't have to think about certain things when he was talking simply about halakha. So I wonder if there's evolution between one and the other. And yes, I think he's struggling. And we're following his struggle because for some reason we're struggling with similar things. It's a different age, different time, but struggling with Similar concept. Why do we do these things? Or why do we choose not to do these things? Or which ones do we choose to do? And which ones do we, I don't think any one of us takes our clothes to have a shotness check, but other people do. So for us, I could be mistaken, but for us, the issue of shotness is not it's there in the Torah, but we don't do it. We've chosen not to do it, but we've chosen to do other things. And how do we make those decisions? And when we choose not to do something, is that simply because it's not meaningful? Because it's a pain in the neck to do? How we make these decisions is very hard. So let's go on a little bit. So chapter 9 begins with the idea that the mitzvot are there to help people become more, quote, natural, balanced and whole. But is this only for Jews? That God introduces God's self in the Ten Commandments as our liberator. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. That's God's authority, God's connection. And on that basis, God makes exclusive demands. History is the source of God's authority and religious inspiration. But for Maimonides doesn't see God's authority in history, but God's authority is in nature. God as having a unique role with Jews in liberating us is a particularistic view of our connection to God. And from Maimonides, that sees the authority in nature is a universal idea. That God is the God, not of the Jewish people, but God is the God of all people. And he compares that with Yehuda Levy. Yehuda Levy lives about 100 years before Maimonides. Both of them were born in Spain. Yehuda Levy ends up dying in Israel. But Yehuda Levy saw Judaism as somehow superior. We are the chosen people. And the summit for Yehuda Levy is blocked to others. We are a kingdom of priests. And therefore, we as Jews have an open channel to God. But for Maimonides, prophecy, remember, prophecy was a natural extension of wisdom, that anybody could aspire to prophecy with proper education, proper training. You had moral, intellectual, and imagination perfection. That was possible, as far as Maimonides was concerned, not just for Jews. That was possible really for anybody. So it's a universe. Prophecy was possible for anyone, and because it came from human initiative. God's concern is not just for Israel. By the way, I always thought that's the reason of the first 10 chapters of Genesis. What is the mythic beginning of of Rome? The mythic beginning of Rome is Romulus and Remus. Right? He's that in most national stories, they begin with the superhero originator of that particular group. Our Torah begins for the first 10 chapters with a universal story. We begin with creation. We begin with Adam and Eve, and it's not till 10 generations till Noah, and another 10 generations until we get to the beginning of our story, which is the story of Abraham. So all those stories in the beginning, creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, the Tower of Babel, they're not Jewish stories. They are universal stories. God as God of not the Jewish people, but God of the universe. So God's concern is not just for Israel. It doesn't matter whether one is enlightened. One is a prophecy is available whether one is enlightened, not whether one is Jewish. There's no Jewish monopoly, but we do have an advantage. What is our advantage? Our advantage is mitzvot, that we possess a personal training program, and which non-Jews don't have, and it's to their disadvantage. That all of these are available to everybody, but we begin with with an advantage. So in other words, prophecy is more available to Jews because we have the most successful educational program. It's a very, very interesting idea. So both the guide and the Mishnah Torah, philosophy is blind to ethnic differences. Even so, halacha insists on them. That they're very different sensibility. There are all kinds of laws that apply only to Jews. And then our author goes something very, very interesting, where he says that in several places, he only gives us two, I think, in several places in the Mishnah Torah, which is this compilation of Jewish law, the Maimonides lists the norms, what is the halacha, and then gives possibilities for those who want more, those who want to go further, those who want to be deeper. That's not required, but for those who would like to express themselves even greater, Maimonides gives them an option. And the example here is, the first example is the treatment of Jewish slaves is prescribed in the Torah, but the treatment of non-Jewish slaves is not prescribed. So Maimonides goes through what is how a non-Jewish slave is, how a Jewish slave is to be treated according to Jewish law, and then he goes on. He says, but if you have a non-Jewish slave, if you want, you can go further. You can be kind. You can be humane. You can not humiliate him. You can act with compassion and embrace a universal commitment to all people. This is has a sense of blinders to ethnic differences. Which creates a non-halachic space of moral excellence. It's sort of interesting that this is not required by halacha, but this is a space where you can go that's beyond the law. And we have not only Maimonides talks about this, but we have in other places in Jewish tradition. Here is the limits of the law, but it's preferable if you don't limit yourself to simply what is required by the law, but go even further. So religious excellence is only accessible to Jews, but freeing from the halakha implies a democratization of the highest reaches of religious achievement. And the second example he gives, the first one was treatment of non-Jewish slaves. Of course, a very uncomfortable subject for us. I don't think, by the way, interestingly, I don't think that the halakha ever outlawed slavery. And as a matter of fact, if you read a wonderful book about American Judaism, the Harvard professor, not Harvard professor, Brandeis professor, he talks about a guy who became a spokesman for the South. He was from the North, spokesman for the South during the Civil War, because he said slavery is permitted in the Bible. And I don't think I know of any place where slavery is actually outlawed in Jewish tradition. But the second example he gives is the status of the tribe of Levy. Now remember, Levy was Moses' tribe. It was also the tribe from which the Kohanim come, because Aaron, Moses' brother, was the first Kohen. And the tribe of Levy was not given, all the other tribes were given land. The tribe of Levy were not given land. They were to be the civil servants. They were to service the Levim were supposed to service the Kohanim in the temple, and they were to be not to do regular labor, and were exempt from going to war. According to Maimonides, living the life of a Levite was really open to anyone. All people who choose to devote themselves to the life of study and contemplation is open to all people, which is going beyond the confines of the law. I think that's really where he ends. Lisa, did you want to add?
Yeah. Well, were you thinking of Jonathan Sarna?
Is Jonathan Sarna? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
American Judaism, I think it's called.
Okay. The one thing that sort of strikes me about his, he says you don't have to be a Jew following our rules to become a prophet, right? But
highest level of human
the highest
being.
level, but I didn't see it where he said, but you have to incorporate our rules into your thinking, because what he doesn't deal with, at least so far, is the same issue that the Puritans had and other groups, where if you say that an individually can contemplate and move to the highest level, and if there are no social checks, how do you know when that person goes from being a prophet to being somebody who's spouting views that are anti-prophetic, right? The opposite of what you want. And he doesn't address that when he loosens it up, because someone who goes outside of our boundaries can also be a prophet. I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure that he's talking about prophecy as being someone who gets up on the and proclaims the word of God. I think he's talking about people who, what was it, reach for and achieve moral, intellectual, and imagination perfection.
But how would you know that unless they?
Well, you may not
That's
know
how
that
they-
if it's outside person. You know that and what do you get from that perfection? You get access to God. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to recognize you as a prophet. I'm surprised, and I don't know whether Maimonides does this as well. You know, in the story of Bilam, Bilam is this non-Jewish magician that the king Balak hires to curse the Jewish people. But nowhere in the Torah or in Jewish does anybody make fun of the fact that how can somebody who's not Jewish become a call it a magician, call it a prophet, call it a because he is understood to be able to do magical things. And in the end, what he ends up doing is he spouts God's words. But you know, he's a non-Jewish, one can say he's a non. Did he reach moral, intellectual, and imagination perfection? I would guess that Maimonides would say that somehow he did, in order to have that access to God. So, but I don't know that he's saying, Lisa, that in order to be a prophet, you have to be observant. If you're Jewish, yes, you have to do all those things. But if you're not Jewish, you can somehow achieve that kind of perfection without being maybe you have to observe the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, the 7 commandments that were given to Noah by our tradition, 7 basic moral commandments. Trudy?
The whole thing about trying to be closer to God, et cetera, takes me back to chapter 1, where he says God doesn't care about people, that he's separate. It's to me, it's a great big conflict from what we saw in chapter 1 to now, what we're studying now.
And he's saying that God does,
Well, that
God doesn't change. God is unchanging.
Right.
But I'm not sure that he's saying that God doesn't care.
Well, how could if
but you can't do something. In other words, you can't reform your life and get God's attention so that God will now reach out to you in a different way.
But then God is, but then isn't God becoming, what's the word, anthropomorphized or whatever that word is, that he could talk to people? I mean, he's not supposed to be something that's like us necessarily.
Well, we have this, we deeply want to believe in fairness in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Fairness in the world, meaning good people are rewarded and bad people are punished, despite all the examples that we have where that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Where a 22-year-old police officer gets shot this week and killed. But we desperately hold on to that idea that somehow the world is fair. The world is just. And maybe 99.9% of the time the world is just. Maybe the percentage is less than 99.9. But we have too many examples of where we feel, where's justice? In that example that I think we talked about of Maimonides being with Rabbi Akiva, of Moses being with Rabbi Akiva, and seeing that Rabbi Akiva is a great scholar, but Rabbi Akiva is tortured by the Romans, and Moses says, "What kind of reward is that?" And God's response is, "Don't ask." Don't ask, right? That we want somebody like Rabbi Akiva to live to 100, to have honor and respect. Honor and respect he gets, but he's a martyr. So since we desperately want there to be order, even so we know that, and so what is the source of the order? We want it to be God. Maimonides says it's not God. Don't mind the crash. That was my wife.
Then why, if it's not God, then why do all the mitzvot? Why?
To perfect yourself and to have a sense of nearness to God. That's what Maimonides is clearly saying, that doing the mitzvot is for your own virtue.
That's what I
And
find
it's-
confusing. I
What's
don't
that?
think the motivation is to serve God and to do it out of love of God. But you're really doing all of these things to make you a better human being and be a better part of your community. So is it really important? It seems like Judaism always thought it's the doing and the action that is much more important than what's your motivation, what's in your mind. So if that's true, then isn't your behavior and the actions actually, doesn't that take precedence over that doing it for the reason that you're doing it for love of God?
I would think that he would say, yes, doing is most important. And if you're having trouble thinking about why you're doing it, don't think about it. Because that the reason for doing it will become obvious if you do it long enough.
But there's a real fine line between indifference, right? I feel like I've struggled all my life with trying to figure out my relationship with God. And then I finally said, I'm not going to try to figure it out. I'm just going to give up and accept it for what it is and not try to question it. But, it just feels like there can be a real fine line between indifference and belief that you just
accept it.
Yeah, just accept it. It's a
Accept
tough
it.
one.
Not only accept it, but I think the reasons change. I think the reasons change as we get older, as certain circumstances in our lives change, that we may have certain motivation that when we have young kids is very different than when we don't have any kids at home. The motivation changes with generations. What motivated or what thoughts my grandparents had is not the same as my parents, and is certainly not the same as my own thoughts. And my children, I know, are in a completely different place than I am. Even so, they all belong to synagogues. That's really shocking. They all belong to synagogues. That three of them keep kosher, at least in the house. I don't think any of them are strictly Sabbath observance, though they may do a Shabbos dinner. And what their motivation is probably all different. All right, so we finished section 2. we've already read, and we'll read it again, the next chapter, which is at chapter 10.
Yeah,
Yes.
chapter 10.
So we read chapter 10 already. Let's read chapter 10 again and chapter 11. Okay, so this section, remember the first section is called God, the second section is called Torah, and now perplexity, which may be the most interesting section now that we have the whole background of sort of where Maimonides is coming from on all of these things. His understanding of Jews in the world and the role of mitzvot will carry on. So Jennifer,
It would be great if you could make me co-host. Thanks, Rabbi.
yes, more. And here we go.
Is it Jennifer
Done.
Knudsen?
No.
Oh, okay.
See you next week.
Okay. See you
And
next Thursday.
You can stop the
Anytime.
recording.
Pardon me?
I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.